In this lecture, we return to the figure of Elihu, specifically in order to examine his character. Notice, for example, in addition to his anger, his frustration at having to remain silent, we also notice that Elihu is very accusatory towards Job. So, for example, in verse 35, he says, Job speaks without knowledge, his words are without wisdom. Verse 16, therefore Job opens his mouth in vain. This is chapter 34, verse 16. Job opens his mouth in vain. He multiplies words without knowledge. And as I pointed out in the last lecture, this is actually how God characterizes Elihu's words. But at this point, Elihu is directing these inflammatory remarks towards Job. He's accusing Job of being religiously ignorant and, of course, severely mistaken because, of course, according to the syllogism which Elihu and the other three friends operate by, if you're punished as severely as Job has been punished, by definition, you must be a wicked person. And therefore, anything that Job says to the contrary is counted as folly. That's Elihu's position, and it's not really that different than the three friends' position. He just argues it more vociferously with a higher degree of personal pride. So, for example, to the issue of pride, prideful attitude in Elihu, look at verse 4, actually 36, chapter 36, verses 2 and 4. Verse 2 begins, bear with me a little and I will show you. There are yet words to speak on God's behalf. So he is a self-appointed prophet, as it were, a self-appointed defender of God. He says in verse 3, I will fetch my knowledge from afar. I will ascribe righteousness to my Maker. That all sounds very pious. For truly my words are not false. For one who is perfect in knowledge is with you. Yes, so he will ascribe righteousness to his Maker, and in the very same breath proclaim that he, Elihu, is perfect in knowledge. So Job, aren't you lucky? You have Elihu in the room. He's perfect in knowledge. He acknowledges God as his Maker, but in the same breath, he also proclaims that he is perfect in knowledge, a statement which, frankly, undermines any idea that he is in fact serving God or subject to God. In fact, he's kind of claiming equality with God. I'm perfect in knowledge. This is an astounding remark. I am perfect in knowledge, especially if you contrast it with Job. Job only knows that he cannot identify a sin which would justify the suffering he has endured. He does not attempt to answer his own questions. He knows he is not perfect in knowledge, and that's exhibited in the simple fact that Job keeps asking for solutions, for answers, for understanding. Contrast that with Elihu, who says he has perfect knowledge. Well, it's true. If you operate off the syllogism that Elihu and his friends move from, you can come to the point where you believe that you can explain everything regarding all the ins and outs related to human suffering. If you have this simple assumption that anyone who suffers grievously is wicked, it's pretty easy to explain human suffering. All human suffering is caused by human iniquity and wickedness. Well, in a sense, that's true. But it doesn't account for the fact that there are people on the planet who are relatively innocent. There are also people on the planet like Job who are in fact righteous, who do not commit known sins. They walk with God, and they too suffer. That syllogism simply can't cover those situations. But rather than responding to those exceptions or complexities that are out there in the world of real events, Elihu and his three colleagues, although of course Elihu doesn't really identify with them, but in fact he shares their logic, their assumptions. If you're like them, you don't look at the actual situation. You don't look at Job. You don't look at his experience. What you do is you take your syllogism, you take your assumption, and you cram reality into it, and anything that doesn't fit simply can't exist. So that describes a kind of thinking where I have the world figured out. It goes something like this. I have the world figured out, and if you give me any data that doesn't fit, I simply reject that data, or in spite of the facts on the ground, I insist it's something other than what it is. By the way, this is very typical of people who indulge in conspiracy theories. A conspiracy theory is actually nothing less or nothing more than a theory that explains everything. And that may sound harmless, but it's actually not, because a theory that explains everything aspires to a kind of godlike understanding of the world and the events in the world. And that's not a vantage point that we enjoy. Only God has the understanding that can look at everything in the greatest detail, everything that exists in the universe, and understand utterly and completely what it all means and how it fits together. We can't do that. But people who love conspiracy theories, and there are good conservative Adventists who are caught up in this, they enjoy the conspiracy theory because it gives them this sense of having a special inside track. They understand why everything happens. But that's not actually something God has given to us. Well, we have prophecy, we have scripture, but it doesn't explain everything. It explains what we need to know for our salvation and what we need to know in order to love and serve God, but it doesn't explain everything. We aren't given God's understanding of the world, but some of us covet that as Christians. And so the conspiracy theory is tempting to any individual who finds solace in being able to understand and explain everything. But that, of course, is not Christian. That's something else. Christians acknowledge that in this world we only see through a glass darkly. So that's why I'm so concerned about the statement, one who is perfect in knowledge is with you. Elihu is essentially saying, I can explain everything. I have a perfect knowledge. It's a theological knowledge, no less. I have a perfect knowledge of God, a perfect knowledge of everything that happens in the world, and I can explain it to you. And it goes like this. Everything that happens according to your wickedness or your righteousness. God is a very simple being. If you're wicked, he hits you. And if you're righteous, he gives you a love pat. And that's how you explain everything in human existence. It's inane. It's obtuse. And it's a lie. But it sounds very religiously, orthodox, because it's dressed up in the clothing of God is great and all of that. But if you look at these phrases, these comments closely, and you think about them, you realize that the book of Job is a fascinating text because it contains error. And I won't say it's inspired error, but through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, the author of Job has replicated speeches which actually mislead the faithful unless they're watchful and sober and they know the truth. So this is a kind of satire. It will lead you up the garden path. And so many people have read Elihu and thought, oh, Elihu he's actually truly, he's got a grip on reality. His theology is correct. And they read all of Elihu and they think, God, he must have been God's spokesman after all. God is really using Elihu to set Job straight. And once they start thinking that way, then in 38:2, when they read God's question to Job, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Since they've already been, in a sense, deceived by Elihu, they misinterpret verse 2 of chapter 38 and think and assume that it refers to Job. But of course, that does, as I explained in the last lecture, that's grammatically incorrect. Oh, okay. Well, what else about Elihu? I'm only picking out certain comments here because if you read closely the speeches of Elihu, there's of course much of it is true, but then there's this occasional misstep, which invalidates all the truth. It's truth mixed with error. Small amounts of error, great wads of truth. Of course, it's true, but it's misapplied, and it's not really speaking to the real occasion, which is Job's suffering. But in general, vague terms, of course, it's true, but then you get these verses that are simply wrong. Here's one example of that. This is about the righteous. Elihu says, if we obey and serve him, this is chapter 36, verse 11, we the righteous shall spend our days in prosperity, and their years in pleasure. But if they do not obey, they shall perish by the sword, and they shall die without knowledge. So that's the premise for the syllogism. But of course, it's not true that everyone who obeys God spends his days in prosperity and their years in pleasure. Witness Isaiah, who's killed by Manasseh, the prophet Isaiah. Witness Jeremiah, who at one point in his rather miserable career as a prophet to a people who never listened to him, at one point says, oh, for a lodge in the wilderness, if I could just escape all this and go live in a cabin somewhere in the deep, dark woods, that would be really wonderful. These men were righteous. They walked with God. They were chosen by God to be prophets. It is not true that they spent their days in prosperity. This syllogism is false, but it sounds good. It's prosperity gospel. It's the sort of thing we like to hear. And then, of course, Elihu then proceeds. This is chapter 36 and 37. He proclaims God's majesty. Now, this is wonderful, and there's quite a lot in there, which, of course, is true. You can read it for yourself, chapter 37. Look at this, for example, verse 14. Listen to this, O Job, stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. And what's interesting is Elihu asks questions of Job that are similar to the questions that God poses to Job regarding God's work as a creator and his created, the creatures that he's made and the elements and everything that God has made that we identify as from God. But there's a little misstep as well. Now, these are subtle. You got to read carefully to pick them up. But in the midst of this sort of elucidation of God's greatness, we're looking here at chapter 37, verses 1 through 15. You won't find anything in there which you would identify as erroneous. It's true. Elihu aptly and appropriately and powerfully calls attention to God's majesty. But then notice verse 16 of chapter 37. Elihu asked Job, do you know the balance of clouds, those wondrous works of him who is perfect in knowledge? So here Elihu describes God as perfect in knowledge, but earlier we noticed that Job proclaims that he himself, this is chapter 36:4, he himself is perfect in knowledge and he is with Job. So this undermines the entire hymn, as it were, to God's greatness. All of Elihu's attempts to extol God's majesty are completely subverted in verse 16. Not because Elihu says that God is perfect in knowledge, that's appropriate. But all of this is subverted by Elihu because previous to this, he proclaims himself to be perfect in knowledge. So when you think about Elihu's relationship with God and compare that to Job's relationship with God, you see a profound difference. Job asks God for understanding. Job laments his condition. He expresses pain and frustration, maybe not frustration, but bewilderment at what's happened to him. And he expresses it towards God. But he never proclaims perfection of knowledge or even perfection of character. He simply can't identify any basis for his suffering. Elihu, by contrast, extols God's majesty, but at the same time, or at least in the previous chapter, he proclaims himself to be perfect in knowledge. So what kind of relationship can you have with God when you acknowledge that God is great, God is all-knowing, and God is perfect in knowledge, But at the same time, you maintain that you are perfect in knowledge. What would we call that? The desire to be equal with God. Isn't that the sin, the original sin of Satan? To be as God, to have the same perfect knowledge God has. That is why God asks the question, directs the question to Job, who is this? After Elihu finishes speaking, God says, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? And of course, people don't see that as directed at Elihu because everything he says sounds so incredibly pious. But of course, it's theologically incorrect, it's biblically incorrect, but it sounds religiously or politically correct, socially correct. Then verse 19 of chapter 37, Elihu says this, teach us what we should say to him, for we can prepare nothing because of the darkness. Darkness. This is verse 19 is not an easy verse to read. Teach us what we should say to him. In other words, teach me how to talk to God. Now there's a problem with this because this is one of the big problems with religion. We teach people how to talk to God, but we don't teach them. Let me rephrase that. We teach, as Elihu says, what we should say to God. Okay? Notice verse 19 again. Teach us what we should say to God. You know, it's like going to catechism class or taking Bible studies. And the teacher, the religious teacher, teaches all of the students how they should speak to God. Now, that's not altogether wrong, but if that's as far as